my article I picked this year was actually for regarding the U.S. military. So they finally stopped using floppy disks to control the nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons why they had used floppy disks for so long was because it was actually the safest method or most secure method. You can't hack something that doesn't have an IP address, is what one of the colonels said. So my thought was, when I read this article, was how this kind of relates to like what we see in our field and like in the business community of automating everything and everything being online, and then trading kind of convenience and quickness with security and kind of privacy. And maybe get your guys' takes on the current state of, you know, the industry or, you know, businesses in general using either over automating or under automating, and then how that affects risk in their business maybe.
Yeah, I think this is just a theme that's definitely becoming more prominent these days, and businesses are constantly trying to find that right balance between what is secure and safe for their business practices and what they can do to automate things. And I think this is a really good example of trying to find the middle ground between those two things.
So, yeah, I guess before I weigh in on the accounting piece of it, this just reminds me of Battlestar Galactica. Did you guys watch that? Yeah. So they had the wireless, but they had wireless technology, but after the planet was blown up and they're fleeing the Cylon invaders, they can't use the wireless. They always have to like plug all their computers in old school, because if you're on the wireless, then you can get hacked by the Cylons. And so they're in their battleships and everything. They were reverting back to old technology to avoid getting kind of destroyed by the AI. Essentially was the plan. So yeah, this whole floppy disk plan reminds me of that strategy.
So what you're saying, Tyee, is we should all stock up on our corded iPhones or corded phones and shortwave radios in case of an impending apocalypse from AI.
Right, exactly. And I guess then if we take that to the extreme of being really secure with our accounting, we would be using the old general ledger log books with pencil and you wouldn't have it on the computer at all. But or you go to the next level and you're like, okay, I have it on an isolated computer. And I think that is what we see now, right? Is that the companies that don't want to go to the cloud, this is one of the things they cite is, it's a security risk. And so, we're going to stay off the cloud in our desktop computer with a desktop system that is just on that one computer, and keep our accounting in there for security reasons. I think you just have to have a perspective about your business and about the nature of the risks for your business. I mean, certainly there's some businesses, particularly if you're in financial functions, if you're banks, or if you are storing confidential kind of identification information. So having been a partner in an accounting firm where we did a lot of tax return work, there's a lot of concern over the fact that you've got people's identification numbers and their names and addresses on file. You've got all that stuff on file that could be used to, in theory, open a credit card in somebody's name or do some kind of fraudulent activity. So safeguarding that stuff in that context makes a lot of sense to me. I think sometimes for like the small businesses that are trying to safeguard their general ledger information, when there is no actual like credit card numbers, there's no necessarily any kind of identification numbers on the general ledger itself. I suspect it's overkill. I mean, the worst thing that could happen is that the information about your business gets out there and maybe becomes available to a competitor or something. Might be the risk, but again, I think you have to step back and ask how likely is that. So. It depends on the nature of the accounting data that's involved. Is it transactional data that's used to actually execute and have access to bank accounts and credit cards and other kinds of identifying information, or is it simply like reporting information like income statements and balance sheets and those kinds of things? Because a cash flow statement is probably not going to lead to you being defrauded if your cash flow statement gets out and around, kind of thing, right? So.
I think another interesting thing to bring up here is just that the EU is bringing out the GDPR and all the regulation, which is basically designed at this exact thing about how do companies safeguard their customer information and whether or not a customer should be able to request whatever information that company has available on them. And so I think it's one of the changing areas of regulation that to keep up with.
Yeah, I think and I don't, that's a whole different bent on it, right? Like, how much does regulation hurt or help? Because if you know, a lot of, I think what we see with companies that are trying to comply with those regulations is that they're going through a checklist of steps, but are they really owning that process? Are they really taking it to heart? And I think that's what we often see with regulation is that people kind of, okay, in business, we're like, okay, we got this extra regulation we have to follow, so now we're gonna go through the steps. But particularly U.S. companies that are having to apply this in a context where maybe it's because they have one European customer or something, right? I think it's sometimes precarious because I guess what I'm saying about that is it may create a false sense of security. Oh, we went through the steps, we followed the checklist, we can say we complied with EU regulations, so that means we're secure, right? Well, maybe not if kind of you follow the checklist, but you've got people kind of in their hearts that aren't really taking security seriously in the organization. Yeah,
that's true. And I came from a firm before this one that was, so I guess I straddled both sides of the line here on using technology wisely, and then kind of the benefits of being low tech or offline, sort of. So in my former life, I was an auditor, and we were actually a paper firm. And although it was very, very inefficient as far as workload goes, it was very efficient when it came to reviewing and to seeing with your eyes, to a visual person, the organization and the kind of tactile feel of being able to see a supporting document that would match something on top, a number on top. So, but you take away, and not thinking about the security side of it, but thinking more about the efficiency side. Now that we work in basically an all digital company where everything is online, I find the speed and efficiency at which things can done far outweigh the benefits that I saw the old school way. Yeah. And granted, it's much easier to read something on a piece of paper and to have two pieces of paper side by side and eyeball and put your fingers on two different numbers that agree. But the functionality that's given to us in the technology portion of being able to do something at the click of a finger, I think is something that outweighs those benefits of being offline.
Yeah, and I think the tricky part is trying to find just that perfect balance between having some kind of approval process in place for your various things and having technology efficiencies that are still increasing your overall efficiency of how you're doing whatever you're doing.
So that's an interesting point. When do you think somebody over-automates? Or when does over-automation, I think, happen?
I think it's important to look at each process and determine where the value is being added by the person who's doing it. So if we're looking at payments and there's approvals in place, then the final step where a person's looking at that payment and deciding, okay, this is okay, well, that's where that person's value add is. And so automating every step up to that makes sense, but anything at that level or beyond it seems like it would be an over-automation where you're just trusting the system.
Right.
Yeah, and I think as an advisor that works with kind of small businesses that are growing and they're starting to think about more and more systems that they could deploy, they start thinking about, how can we use automation? What kind of investment should we make in different kinds of systems that might be necessary to run our business? I always look at that. I always say, well, you've got to have human understanding first before you automate. And I think that kind of building off what Charlie was saying is that the problem often comes with trying to implement a system to automate something that you didn't understand to begin with, and thinking that the automation resolves your lack of understanding. Right. And probably like the one that comes to my mind right now that I see so commonly is working with growing small kind of manufacturers or product-based businesses that do some kind of manufacturing or assembly that require a certain amount of cost accounting to try to figure out what the actual cost per unit is and build that up and track that information and have that in their both in their inventory records, but also being able to, if they're perhaps doing multiple SKUs, they're doing multiple products and they're wanting to be able to determine that some products have a higher or lower cost, some products have a higher or lower margin, and all of that's good information and important information. But I think that the the entrepreneur and the accountants involved have to have a base understanding of the cost accounting. And that I don't think that is resolved by rushing in and implementing an ERP system, for example, which is what I often see people do in terms of, well, we don't know anything about cost accounting, but we know because we're manufacturing inventory, all of our advisors or all of our people that we've talked to are comparable companies. They all use ERP systems, so we think that's the solution, that we're just going to run in and implement an ERP system. And that's usually where I like to pump the brakes and say, okay, yeah, it's quite possible that an ERP system will save you a lot of time and be beneficial to you in the long run, but let's make sure that you understand what that ERP system would actually be doing before you implement it. And often for a small business, one of the best ways to understand what the ERP system would be doing is to do it without the automation,
Yes.
to do it without automation first, and then diagnose where automation would actually be helpful, rather than trying to over-automate or over-engineer something that you've never done before in the first place.
I agree completely.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think understanding, like, if you have a solid understanding of the underlying system and how it works, then that makes A, the automation easier, but B, I think it brings to the forefront whether you could or could not automate it, or whether that would be a good decision
Yeah.
once you have the grasp of what the underlying levers to that is.
Well, you can't forget that these systems that are going to help you automate, these are businesses. And so, they're going to throw in all kinds of bells and whistles of things that may or may not be helpful for extra add-on fees, or they're going to really sell their system because it does some great thing that they're telling you it does. But if you've actually been doing it yourself manually and you've felt the pain of that and you realize here's where it would be helpful to automate, I think it can help you kind of cut through that BS,
Sure.
really, to kind of say, does the system actually do the things that I need to automate, or are they throwing in a bunch of things that sound cool but in fact wouldn't help my particular use case? And I think being able to identify that and not overspend on things that don't even help you, is part of the game there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely seen companies that get wrapped up in Salesforce and in different ERP systems where they spend all their time trying to automate things and trying to get that system to do what they want it to do, but they're missing out on the much more basic thing behind the scenes that they were really got them into it in the first place.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's a saying, you mentioned Salesforce and CRM, and I don't know if Salesforce themselves coined this saying, but I've heard other CRM software folks and consultants, they have this saying where they say CRM is a process, not a software. Customer relationship management, right?
Right.
It's a process, not a software. The software is just a tool that helps you run that process. And so yeah, you have to have a process that the software is helping you with before the software can actually be useful.